Good morning, Scotland. Good morning, social media land. I hope you are well. It is Monday, the 9th of December, 2024. The other day there, I was past an old newspaper clipping from a friend that dates back to 2006. Take a look at it, pause and read it please, or screen capture it and read it later, as it is vitally important to the context of this week's videos. Its headline, Independence Cover-Up, "We would be rich," is enticing enough, but the body of the text discusses that civil servants in Whitehall knew before the oil came ashore in Scotland that the wealth it would generate would make Scotland the wealthiest nation in Europe. And they conspired to influence politicians to prevent that knowledge from reaching the people of Scotland. They knew that if we knew, there would have been cries for independence. They knew that they had to keep this quiet. However, this was not the McCrone Report. This was actual memos and communications that were exchanged amongst the movers and shakers of Westminster at the time. The newspaper clipping is an eye-opener, but what intrigued me the most was the very last sentence. The papers are to form the basis of a Radio 4 documentary tonight at 8 p.m. Wait, so the BBC made a radio doc, what we would call a podcast nowadays, about these documents and communications? Well, I had to go about finding this podcast and hearing it for myself. 2 hours later, I found out the name of the documentary series, the title of this episode, the journalist who researched it and narrated it, but no link in any of the Radio 4 archives that would lead me to listening to the podcast. In fact, the series titled Document by Mike Thompson could be easily seen in the archive. You could even see the episode I was looking for. The title is called It's Our Oil. But every episode for 2006 was not available to listen to. I found that particularly strange. I took a coffee break from researching this, as I felt like, well, of course, they've made it unavailable. A podcast on the BBC with civil servants and Denis Healey admitting that they had deliberately conspired to keep the truth about Scotland's wealth from the Scottish people. Yeah, I would not want that doing the rounds either. But caffeine-fueled tenacity pushed me on, and about an hour later I discovered the entire series had been published as an audiobook. Awesome! I was not disappointed. This was Activist Gold, a BBC podcast from 2006 unearthed with interviews from civil servants, from chancellors, and even Sean Connery, was now in my hands to cut up and use to deliver a message to all of Scotland. A message that many of us already understand. One that says Scotland has been manipulated, robbed and raped of its wealth and its opportunity. If by the end of this week's videos, being part of the union still leaves a sweet taste in your mouth, then I truly believe that you're beyond hope. Please share this after you've watched it, and remember, this is only part 1. Scotland's history is one of resilience, innovation, and immense potential, yet it's also a history being held back. Few moments illustrate this better than the story of North Sea oil in the 1970s. A resource that could have transformed Scotland into one of the wealthiest nations in Europe. Instead, its potential was deliberately suppressed and its wealth exploited for the benefit of Westminster. At the time, the United Kingdom was in crisis. Inflation had reached record highs, strikes had paralysed industries, and fears of economic collapse loomed large. For Westminster, North Sea oil wasn't just a blessing, it was salvation. But for Scotland, this oil represented something far greater, a chance to reshape its future, to take control of its economy, and to step confidently into the world as an independent nation. What followed was a calculated strategy by Westminster to centralise control over this resource, ensuring that its wealth would flow south to stabilise the UK, rather than north to benefit Scotland. Documents hidden from the public for decades, now revealed through Freedom of Information requests, expose the extent of this suppression. Listen for yourself to the first letter penned by Peter Mountfield, a Treasury official back in the 1970s.
The first letter is dated the 15th of February 1974. That's a good 18 months before North Sea oil started flowing. It was written by a rather worried Treasury official called Peter Mountfield to his colleague, a Mr. Harrop. It was agreed in the discussion that we have a real problem on our hands here.
Scottish oil is going to become a major political issue, whether we like it or not. We agreed that this should be brought out clearly for ministers, and that it should not merely be brushed aside. We should make it clear that the sums involved are much larger than the present oil revenues. It is no secret that the government is considering increasing the take, since we have said as much publicly.
This letter reveals the depth of Westminster's anxiety. Scotland's oil wealth wasn't just an economic opportunity, it was a political crisis waiting to happen. Mountfield's memo made it clear Scotland's oil would become a major political issue, and the sums involved were far larger than anyone was prepared to admit publicly. For Westminster, this wasn't just about managing oil, it was about managing Scotland's ambitions. In the podcast, Edward Pearce, Denis Healey's biographer, was asked to comment on this.
So, given all this, what was going through the minds of the government, both Denis Healey and other cabinet ministers, when they looked across the border in Scotland and saw that there was growing support for Scotland to at least request devolution or even independence, fundable by the oil that was obviously going to be flowing?
What it boiled down to was that the thing that was going to save us, and that we've been going on about very quietly and discreetly for 10 years, understating always how much, but knowing in fact that there was about 4 times as much as any figure we put out, was going to be snatched away from us. If you then say, actually, Hamish McGregor up in Edinburgh wants 80% of it, because it's our oil, you would have said you're taking away salvation as we know it.
The UK was facing an economic storm. Inflation was spiralling, labour strikes were crippling industries, and the government feared financial collapse. North Sea oil was their lifeline. Westminster needed this wealth to stabilise the UK economy, but Scotland's growing calls for devolution or even independence posed a direct threat to their plans. Edward Pearce's remarks lay bare the mindset of the time. Westminster saw Scottish oil not as Scotland's resource, but as the salvation for the entire UK. Allowing Scotland to control, say, 80% of this wealth would have been unthinkable, a scenario that threatened to snatch away salvation as they knew it. The stakes were high. Westminster's response was calculated. Just days before the general election of February 1974, Peter Mountfield drafted another document.
On the 25th of February 1974, just 3 days before the first general election that year, Treasury official Peter Mountfield penned the draft of a financial report for ministers, some of which was marked confidential, and he sent it to a Mr. Wiggins.
Traditionally, Scotland and Wales have benefited from membership of the UK, as expenditure on national services in the two countries has exceeded their revenue-raising capacity. North Sea oil completely changes this picture. First, there is a plausible case for arguing that it is Scottish. There are accepted international conventions for drawing the median lines separating the continental shelf between sovereign states. All the oil fields so far, and most of the geologically promising areas, are on the Scots side of this line. And this fact is well known in Scotland. Second, the potential revenues from North Sea oil dramatically reverse the present deficit of a hypothetical Scots government. It is easy to see why Scottish oil has become a rallying cry for the nationalists. But this very embarrassment of riches poses further problems. If all North Sea oil revenues accrued to Scotland, the revenues will far exceed the likely needs of a separate Scots government. The actual oil produced will be 10 times total Scots oil consumption. The obvious response for Scotland, as it has already been for Norway in an exactly similar situation, is to consider restricting the flow of oil, to make it, and the revenues, last longer. But for the UK economy, in which Scotland had only limited autonomy, this could be disastrous. If we go further and contemplate a break-up of the UK monetary union, a prospect which Scottish nationalists will now find very tempting, the rest of the UK loses the balance of payments advantages almost completely.
This report reveals the heart of Westminster's dilemma. Mountfield clearly understood and admitted what was already clear. Under international conventions, the vast majority of North Sea oil fields lay in Scottish waters. These resources had the potential to transform Scotland's economy, reversing any financial deficit and creating surpluses far beyond its needs. For Scotland, this wealth could have funded infrastructure, reduced poverty and mirrored Norway's approach to creating long-term prosperity through sustainable oil management. But for Westminster, this presented a political nightmare. Mountfield warned of the consequences. If Scotland gained control of its own oil wealth, it could easily justify breaking away from the UK monetary union. This would mean the rest of the UK losing nearly all the balance of payments and advantages that oil provided, a disaster for the struggling British economy. These revelations are not only about history, they expose a pattern of suppression and control. Westminster, unwilling to lose Scotland's oil, downplayed the wealth's potential and tightly controlled the narrative. Imagine what might have been a Scotland where oil wealth supported schools, hospitals, and world-class infrastructure, a nation where industries thrived and poverty was a thing of the past. Instead, Scotland's resources were siphoned off to stabilise the UK, leaving Scots with little more than the rhetoric of unity. This story isn't an isolated case. It's part of a broader pattern where Westminster controls Scotland's resources, limits its autonomy, and ensures it remains subordinate within the Union. Renewable energy projects, infrastructure investment, and modern resource management all follow the same trajectory and centralisation and control. The evidence is clear. Westminster's actions in the 1970s reveal a deliberate strategy to suppress Scotland's economic potential and silence its political ambitions. This is not the story of a union of equals. It's the story of a nation exploited for the survival of another. This week we will dissect this podcast with commentary and opinion. It's not pretty and it's very damning for the English Westminster elite. It even shines a spotlight on some of Scotland's most well-known politicians of the time, the spotlight showing who they truly were and not what history represents them as. They planned the theft of our oil. The McCrone Report is nothing compared to these memos. This is conspiracy for the theft of an entire nation's wealth. Modern colonialism in its rawest form and most criminal. Please join us tomorrow when we shall continue this story.
I can't get no sleep.